The frost came early that year, and it came hard, and it did not loosen its grip on Fenbrook until well past the turn of the month. Wood smoke hung low over the lanes. The air smelled of wet wool and tallow, and the cold, clean iron of a well pump gone stiff overnight. Hester Vane walked through it with her basket on her arm, and her shawl pinned twice at the throat, because once was never enough in that wind. She was the kind of woman a room forgot the moment she left it. Not pretty, not plain enough to be pitied for it, not poor enough to beg, nor rich enough to matter. 25 years old, a curate's daughter with no curate left to claim her, she mended linen for 3 houses in the village, and copied letters for those who could not write their own. And she read. That was the thing about her nobody else in Fenbrook could do. Her father had taught her letters before he taught her anything else, and then he had taught her Latin from his own old primer, sitting her on a stool by the fire, and making her sound out the psalms until she could read them faster than he could. He had been dead 2 winters now. The primer was the only thing of his she had kept. Before the week was out, the frost was going to take somebody's roof. She did not know it yet, walking down toward the mill road with her basket, but she felt it the way she felt rain coming in her knuckles. Something in the cold that year had teeth. She was going to see Nell Coombe. Nell took in washing when her hands allowed it, and had a boy, Tam, 8 years old, who swept the crossing by the church for whatever coin the gentry dropped him. Hester had heard from the miller's wife that the boy had taken a fever, and fevers in that kind of cottage, in that kind of December, were not small things. The cottage stood at the end of a lane with no name, 1 room and a loft, smoke struggling up out of a chimney that wanted mending worse than any of Hester's other work. She knocked once and let herself in, because Nell's hands were too full of her son to come to the door. The boy was worse than she had feared. His breath came in a thin whistle. His mother knelt by the pallet with a cloth she kept wetting and wringing, and laying back on his forehead. And her own face had gone the grey of ash. The doctor wants a shilling before he'll cross the threshold, Nell said. She did not look up. I have not got a shilling. I have not got 6pence. Hester set the basket down and knelt on the other side of the boy. She did not ask whether she should help. She simply began. She sent the eldest Coombe girl running for the miller's wife, who kept a store of feverfew and knew how to build a poultice. She built up the fire herself with wood she had brought in the basket, because she had guessed, walking down, that there would be none to spare. She sat through the worst of the evening with the boy's hot hand in hers, and she did not once say that she would rather be elsewhere, because she would not. It was near midnight when the paper came under discussion. Nell fetched it from behind the clock where she had hidden it, as though hiding it might make it stop being true. It was the notice the estate agent had nailed to half the doors on the lane that week. Mr. Grissom's notice, stiff paper with a red wafer seal, half of it set out in the crabbed legal Latin that agents like to use, because it made a thing sound more lawful than it was. He read it out to me himself, Nell said. Said I owe 3/4 rent, and if it is not paid by Candlemas, out we go. I cannot make 3/4. I could barely make one. Hester took the paper and angled it to the firelight. She was quiet for a long moment. He did not read you all of it, she said. He read the whole thing. Stood right there and read it. He read you the arrears clause. Hester's finger moved along the line. He did not read you this. Salvo semper redemptionis jure. The right of redemption is always saved. There is a grace clause here, Nell, 60 days from the date of notice, and any tenant may make up half the sum and hold the rest over till spring. He never told you that. He read you the frightening half, and kept the kind half for himself. Nell's hand went to her mouth. You can read that. You can truly read that. My father taught me. Hester folded the paper along its old crease, carefully, the way a thing is folded that will be needed again. You are not turned out by Candlemas, not by half what he told you. I will write it out plain for you tomorrow, in English, so you never have to trust his reading of it again. She did not say it as a triumph. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, and went back to wetting the cloth for the boy's forehead, because the fever had not broken yet, and that mattered more than any clause. What she did not see, in the low light of that room, was the man in the doorway of the lane outside, standing where the cottage's own candle threw no light, and the moon gave only a little. He had come down from the inn on foot, in a plain dark coat with no crest on it, to look at his own tenancies with his own eyes, before anyone in the great house knew he had returned to look at anything. He had meant only to walk the lane, and note which roofs wanted mending. He had not meant to stand in the cold for the better part of an hour watching a woman in a darned shawl fight a fever and a fraud at once, for a family that could give her nothing back, because she believed no one of any consequence would ever know she had done it. She did not know then that the man in the doorway owned the cottage, and the lane, and the notice, and Mr. Grissom's very ink. She did not know that he had come to Fembroke under a false name to catch his own steward stealing from people too poor, and too unlettered to catch him themselves, and that she had just done, without knowing it, exactly what he had crossed 2 counties in secret to do. She stayed until the fever broke, near dawn, and then she walked home through a village that did not yet know what it owed her, and neither did she. Nell Combe tried to press a jar of preserves on her at the door, the last of the summer's plums, worth more to that house than it looked. Hester would not take it. You will need those, she said. I would have done it for anyone. Not everyone would, Nell said. Then everyone is wrong. Hester tied her shawl again and stepped out into the grey morning. Keep him warm. Send the girl if the fever comes back. She walked away before Nell could thank her twice, because being thanked once already sat on her like a coat too heavy for the season. 3 days later, Mr. Grissom the steward was gone from Fembroke. No one in the village knew why, only that a closed carriage had come for his ledgers in the night, and that a new man, quiet and careful, had begun going door to door with the estate's old books, asking questions that made the tenants nervous until they understood the questions were not for them. The physician came to the Combe cottage that week, and did not ask for a shilling. He said only that his fee had already been seen to, by a party who wished it kept quiet, and would take no argument on the matter. New boots appeared on the step for Tam before he was even well enough to wear them out, boots that fit, which was itself a kind of miracle in that lane. Nell asked everyone she could think of who had sent them. No one would say. Hester heard all of it second-hand, over the mending basket, and thought little of it beyond a plain gladness that the boy was mending, and the notice had been made to answer for itself. She did not think herself any part of the cause. She had only read a piece of paper aloud, the way she had read 100 pieces of paper aloud for people who could not. The summons came a fortnight after, carried by a groom from Hallcross Hall itself, sealed properly this time, no red wafer but the ducal crest in green wax. It asked Miss Vane to present herself at the housekeeper's room at 11 o'clock, regarding a position. She went because a position was a position, and her rent did not care whether she was proud. She did not expect, walking up the long gravel drive with her father's primer in her pocket for no reason she could have named. That the man who would interview her for the post of copyist would have grey eyes she had seen once before, in the dark, from a lane, and not know it. Mrs. Pryor received her first. The housekeeper was a broad, dry woman with ink permanently under 2 of her nails and no patience for nonsense, who looked Hester over once, head to foot, the way a woman looks over a bolt of cloth she already suspects will serve. "You read Latin, Mrs." Pryor said. It was not a question. My father was a curate. His Grace has a library that has not been properly gone through since his own father's time, and half of it is in a language none of the rest of us can make head or tail of. He wants it catalogued. He wants old leases checked against what is owed and what is claimed owed, which is a different matter than you might think, out here. Mrs. Pryor's mouth did something that was almost a smile and thought better of it. You will be paid fair, and you will keep what you find to yourself until His Grace says otherwise. Can you do that? I have kept other people's business to myself my whole life, Hester said. It is not a hard habit. Mrs. Pryor studied her a moment longer, the way one studies a seam for where it might give. No, she said. I don't imagine it is, for you. She was led through to the library, and there she met, for the first time by name, the man who called himself Mr. Fenwick, secretary to His Grace's affairs in the county, and who was in fact the Duke of Hallcross, wearing his own house like a borrowed coat. He did not rise with any ceremony. He looked up from a desk buried under old vellum, and his eyes went over her once, quick and grave, and something crossed his face that she took for simple assessment, and that was in fact recognition. He said nothing of the lane. He said nothing of the notice, or the fever, or the hour he had stood outside a cottage he owned watching a stranger do a kindness that cost her a night's sleep, and asked for nothing back. Miss Vane, he said. Mrs. Pryor tells me you read Latin faster than most men read English. My father would say that was because I had less to unlearn. It was not quite a joke, and it was not quite not one. Something in his mouth moved, briefly, and was put away again before it could become a smile. Sit, he said. There is a stack there that has been lying to somebody for 40 years. I should like to know what it says. She sat. The work suited her the way few things had. Days ran into weeks in the library at Hallcross Hall, and the room itself became a kind of country she and Mr. Fenwick governed together. Dust and ink, and the smell of old leather binding, a fire that never quite reached the far shelves. He would set a document before her, some ancient tenancy or land grant thick with legal Latin, and she would read it plain into English while he wrote, and more than once she stopped mid-sentence. That does not match the summary in the estate book, she said, the first time it happened. The estate book says the marsh acreage was let at £4. This says 3, with a clause for giving a quarter in a hard winter. Someone has been charging 4 and for giving nothing. He did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, satisfied in a way he tried to keep off his face, and mostly succeeded. Keep a list, he said, of every place the book and the deed disagree. May I ask why? You may ask. I may not yet answer. He set down his pen. Will that trouble you working blind? I have worked blind before, she said. I generally find the light comes on eventually, if I keep working. He was quiet a moment, and then, unusual for him, he laughed, one short note, gone as soon as it came, as though he had startled himself with it. Mrs. Pryor said you were plain-spoken, he said. She did not say you would be amusing about it. I am not trying to be amusing. No, he said. "That is rather what makes it work." He was not, she decided over those weeks, an easy man to read, for a man who spent his days having other men's words read to him. He asked little about himself and answered less. Once, closing a ledger later than either of them had meant to stay, he said, apropos of nothing she had asked, that he did not trust easily, and that a woman had once taught him why. A woman of very fine family, who had been sweet as summer to his face, and had had a maid turned off without wages for breaking a vase that the maid had not broken. He did not name her. He said only that he had learned, watching that, to care a great deal more about how a person treated someone who could do nothing for them than about how they treated him. "That is not a strange thing to care about," Hester said. "You would be surprised how strange most people find it." She thought, but did not say, that she had learned something like the same lesson from the other direction. From being the one who could do nothing for anyone, and knowing exactly which people in Fenbrook still troubled to be kind to her because of it, and which did not. Tam Coombe got a slate and a stick of chalk that winter, left at his mother's door with no note, and began slowly learning his letters from the boots up, as Hester put it to Mrs. Pryor, not knowing that Mrs. Pryor knew a great deal more about the slate's origin than she let show. It was in the 3rd week of that work that Lady Octavia Renshaw came properly into the room, the way weather comes into a house through a door left open too long. She was the late Duke's cousin by marriage, and she had run Hallcross Hall's household since his death with the settled confidence of a woman who expected to go on running it, one way or another, for the rest of her natural life. She was handsome in the manner of a well-kept knife, all clean lines and no softness, and she had a laugh, when she used it, that came in 3 notes exactly, practised, like a bell rung by someone who had counted the strikes. She found Hester and the Duke bent together over a lease at the long table, heads close, and she stood in the doorway a moment before she spoke, letting the silence do some of her work for her. "So this is the girl," she said, "who reads Latin better than a bishop." Hester rose, because it was proper, and inclined her head. "Miss Vane, my lady." Vane, Lady Octavia, said the name as though tasting something she had not ordered. "I knew a family of that name once. They kept a very poor table." Her eyes went over Hester's dress, her ink-stained fingers, the mend at her cuff that did not quite match the cloth. "Tell me, Miss Vane, where does a curate's daughter come by Latin? Most curates cannot afford Latin for their sons, let alone their daughters." "My father thought a mind was worth teaching whatever shape it came in," Hester said. "How democratic of him, and how convenient for you now that his generosity has found you a place among your betters." Lady Octavia's smile did not move past her mouth, though I confess I wonder how a housemaid's wage stretches to gloves like those, or is that a borrowed pair? The room went very quiet. Hester did not look down at her own hands, though she knew exactly what the gloves looked like, mended twice at the seam, because she had mended them herself. "They are mine, my lady," she said. "I have had them some years. I find good work outlasts fashion, if a person is willing to mend it rather than replace it." She paused. "It is a philosophy I apply to most things." For a moment nobody in the room breathed. Then the Duke, without lifting his eyes from the lease in front of him, said, in a voice with no heat in it at all, "Miss Vane's work is the reason this estate will recover 11 years of overcharged rents from a steward I have already dismissed. I would take her mended gloves over a great many unmended reputations I could name." Lady Octavia's 3-note laugh came again, thinner this time. How gallant. "Do be careful, Rafe, or the county will say you have taken up charity as a hobby." She swept out with her skirts making more noise than her feet. Hester sat back down slowly. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. She had learned a long time ago not to let them shake where anyone could see. "You did not need to say that," she said. "I did not say it for you," he said, which was, she would understand much later, the first lie he ever told her, and the only one born of kindness rather than concealment. She did not answer that either. She only picked up her pen and went back to the lease, and if her hand trembled very slightly over the first line, she made certain it steadied by the second. The withdrawal, when it came, did not come from Lady Octavia's tongue. It came from her hand. A folio went missing from the estate archive in the second week of the new year, an old deed of settlement that mattered a great deal to the case the Duke and Mrs. Prior and the county magistrate had been quietly building against the dismissed steward. It was found 3 days later, not missing at all but simply misfiled, tucked behind a shelf of parish registers where anyone might have slid it by accident in the course of an afternoon's cataloguing. It was found, however, in a drawer that only Hester used. She did not put it there. She knew that the way she knew her own name, but knowing a thing and proving it were not sisters, and Lady Octavia stood in the library doorway that morning with 2 footmen and an expression of grave, regretful triumph, and said the words out loud in front of Mrs. Prior and a visiting solicitor from the county town, so that there could be no unsaying them later. I am sorry to say it, but a girl with no name and no fortune, alone in a room full of deeds that determine who owns what in this county, was always a risk his Grace was too soft-hearted to see. I found what I found. I will not pretend otherwise to spare anyone's feelings. I did not take it, Hester said. Her voice did not rise. I would not know what to do with a deed of settlement if I stole one. I read them. I do not sell them. That is precisely what a clever thief would say. The Duke was away that morning, in the county town himself on the steward's business, and did not return until the thing had already been said in front of witnesses, already begun its slow poisoned crawl through the servants' hall, and from there, inevitably, toward the village. By the time he heard of it, Hester had already packed the small bag she had brought with her 3 months before, thanked Mrs. Prior with a steadiness that cost her more than anyone in that house would ever know, and walked back down the long drive to Fenbrook in a cold no worse than the one she had walked up it in, though it felt, that day, considerably harder to bear. She did not weep on the drive. She had trained herself out of that particular weakness years ago, the year her father died, and she had understood that tears changed nothing, and only cost her the appearance of steadiness she could not afford to lose. She walked, and the frost made its small sounds under her boots, and somewhere behind her, in a house she would not enter again, a woman who had never once been kind to anyone who could do nothing for her, was already telling the story a second time, with embellishments. She told herself, walking, that she would not think of him. She thought of him the whole way home. For a week she did not see him, and did not expect to, and told Nell Coombe, when Nell asked, that it was only a position, the kind that ends, the kind she had always known would end, and that she was fortunate to have had it as long as she had. "You do not believe that," Nell said. "It does not matter what I believe," Hester said. "It matters what is true, and what is true is that I am home, and the mending basket is full, and Tam still has his letters even if I do not have my place." She picked up a hem that did not need her attention nearly as much as her hands needed something to do. "That is enough." It was Mrs. Prior who came to disturb that particular piece, on a grey Thursday, in a hired gig she had clearly paid for out of her own pocket, rather than wait for anyone's leave to use the halls. She sat in Hester's one good chair, refused tea twice, and then accepted it, and looked around the small room with an expression Hester could not immediately place, until she understood it was something close to anger, banked and controlled, the kind that has been carried a long way without being allowed to show. "I have come to tell you 3 things, Mrs., Prior said, and I would ask you to let me say all 3 before you say anything back, because I have practised the order of them the whole way here, and I do not want to lose it." Hester folded her hands in her lap. "Go on." "The first is that His Grace did not dismiss you. He was in the county town when it happened, and when he returned and found you gone. He did not sleep, and I do not say that lightly, because I have kept this house 11 years, and I have never once known him to miss a night's rest over anything, not his father's death, not the steward's fraud, nothing, Mrs. Prior's mouth was tight. The second is that the folio was never in your drawer by accident. Lady Octavia's own maid was seen near that shelf the morning before it was found, and His Grace has since learned that Lady Octavia had every reason to want that particular deed to stay lost, because it names the terms under which her own late husband's debts were settled against this estate, terms she has spent years hoping nobody literate enough to read them would ever look at closely again. Hester's hands had gone very still in her lap. And the third, Mrs. Prior set down her cup. "The third," she said, "is that Mr. Fenwick, Secretary to His Grace's affairs, does not exist, and never has. His Grace came to this county under that name to catch a thief among his own people, because he did not trust anyone who knew his face to tell him the truth. He watched a woman sit up all night with a sick boy, and read a false notice plain, and refuse a jar of preserves for her trouble, before he ever gave you a name to call him by. He has been paying that boy's doctor and that family's rent, and half the mended roofs on that lane since the night he watched you do it, and he told me himself, and no one else, that he asked me to say who sent it, and I never did, because he asked me not to, and I keep the promises he asks me to keep." She looked at Hester steadily. "His name is Ralph Sterling. He is the Duke of Hallcross. And he did not hire a copyist, Miss Vane. He hired the only person he had watched, with his own eyes, behave exactly the same whether she thought a duke was watching or nobody was watching at all." Hester sat in the small cold room, with her father's primer on the table beside her, and did not say anything for a long moment. Somewhere outside a robin called once, sharp in the frost, and fell silent. "He let me believe he was nobody," she said at last. "He let you believe he was nobody," Mrs. Prior agreed, "because he wanted, just once in his life, to be loved for it, and not in spite of it." She did not know then, sitting there, how soon she would hear him say something very like that himself. He came 2 days later, on foot, without the carriage, in the same plain dark coat she had first seen him in on the lane, as though he understood that whatever he had to say to her would only be heard properly if he arrived looking like the man she had actually met. The village had already had its say by then. Word of the missing folio and the dismissed girl had run its course through Fenbrook the way such things always did, embroidered at every fireside, until at market that very morning a woman Hester barely knew had turned from her stall and said, loud enough for 6 people to hear, that she did not care to buy thread from fingers that had been light with the Duke's own papers. Hester had said nothing. She had paid for her thread and walked home with her chin level and her hands steady, and it was only once she was inside her own door, alone, that something in her chest had finally, quietly given way. It was into that small, warm room, fire low, kettle just beginning to sing, that he came and stood just inside the door with his hat in his hands, like a man who did not entirely trust himself to sit until he was asked. "I am not here as Mr. Fenwick," he said. "I know who you are," Hester said. "Mrs. Pryor told me. Then you know I owe you an accounting, and not an apology alone, though you shall have both if you want them." He turned the hat once in his hands. "I stood outside Nell Coomb's door in December and watched you save a woman's home with a book you had no reason to still own, and a kindness nobody had asked of you. I did not introduce myself that night because I had come to Fenbrook to find out which of my own people could be trusted, and I did not yet know how to ask that question honestly. So I asked it dishonestly instead. I gave you a false name and watched what you did when you believed no one of any consequence could see you." He paused. "That is the only test that ever tells the truth. Everyone is well behaved in front of a duke. Almost no one is good in an empty lane at midnight for a family that cannot pay them." "You could have told me," Hester said, "once you knew." "I could have. I did not, and that is the part that is mine to answer for, not the disguise itself. I let it run past the point of necessity, because I liked, God forgive me, being a man to you instead of a title. I have not had that in a long while. People are either afraid of me or hungry for what I hold, and you were neither, and I did not want to give that up a day sooner than I had to." He looked at her directly. "I am sorry for the cost of it. I did not intend for it to cost you a village's good opinion, and a false accusation of theft. I intend to correct both, publicly, whether or not you ever wish to see me again." Hester was quiet. The kettle had begun to properly sing now, and she rose and took it off the fire more to have something to do with her hands than because she wanted tea. "I am not angry that you were the Duke," she said finally. "I am angry that I told a stranger things I have told no one since my father died, and did not know I was handing them to a man who could have written my whole life over with a single word, and chose for months to let me believe he could not. You are entitled to that anger. I will not argue you out of it. He did not step toward her. I have not come to ask you to forgive me tonight, or to answer anything tonight. I have come to tell you the truth, all of it, and then I am going to leave, and I am not going to ask you for anything at all until you send for me, if you ever do. I would rather have your no, given freely, once you have had time to be angry and to think, than a yes you gave me tonight because I stood in your doorway looking sorry for myself. That is a strange kind of courting. It is the only kind I trust any more," he said. "I watched a woman I once meant to marry be sweet to my face and cruel to a maid who could not answer her back, and I promised myself I would never again let anyone say yes to me out of fear, or flattery, or because saying no seemed too dangerous to attempt. You have never once, in the whole time I have known you, said anything you did not mean. I will not be the reason you start." He set his hat back on and at the door turned once more. "For what it is worth," he said, "the boy's boots fit him. Mrs. Pryor tells me he has read his first whole page unassisted. I did not do that for thanks. I am only glad now that you know it was me, because I find I did not like keeping it from you nearly as much as I expected to." He left before she could answer, which she understood, even through the anger, to be its own kind of gift. Winter loosened its hold slowly, the way it always did in that country, more retreat than surrender. It was a full month before Hester sent word to the hall, a short note in her own plain hand, asking only that his Grace call upon her, if it suited him, on a matter of business rather than sentiment, because she had thought of a way the estate's Latin deeds might be properly indexed against the parish registers, so that no steward could ever again hide a false arrears behind a language his tenants could not read. He came within the hour, which told her something about how closely her note had been watched for. They did not speak of the anger again directly. It had done its work by then, burned down to something steadier, and what grew up in its place over the following weeks was plainer and, she thought, considerably more durable than what had come before. He asked her, formally this time, name given honestly at every turn, to return to the Hall, not as a copyist but as his affianced wife, and he asked it the way he had promised he would, without pressing, in the library where they had first properly known each other. With Mrs. Pryor discreetly absent, and the fire doing most of the talking for the first minute or two. "I will not ask you tonight for an answer," he said. "I told you once I would rather have your honest no than a frightened yes, and I meant it, and I have not stopped meaning it." "You already have your answer," Hester said. "You have had it since the note. I would not have written to a man I meant to refuse. I am not in the habit of wasting either of our time." Something moved across his face that was, for once, entirely undisguised. He crossed the room, and, with a care that made the small gesture larger than it had any right to be, drew the glove from her right hand, finger by finger, and set it aside, and took her bare hand in both of his, as though it were the single most valuable document in that entire library. "Say it again," he said. "Plainly, I find I do not entirely trust my own hearing where you are concerned." "Yes," Hester said. "It is the only word I have needed since Fenwick asked me to sit down and read him a stack of lies. I did not know then it was you asking. I am glad now that it was." He kissed her hand, not her mouth, slow and grave, the way a man seals something he intends to keep sealed his whole life, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, and neither of them needed to. The betrothal contract was drawn up within the fortnight, and it was Lady Octavia, still resident at the Hall by the narrowest of graces, while the magistrate's business against her late husband's old debts crawled toward its conclusion, who insisted, with a great show of proper form, that certain clauses of the old family settlement be read into the new contract in their original Latin, as had always been done, she said, in every generation of sterling brides before this one, out of respect for custom. Nobody in the room but Hester understood, at first, that custom was not what Lady Octavia was protecting. The solicitor read the English summary aloud to the assembled witnesses, a dowry portion, a widow's jointure, a trust established for the education and maintenance of one Tam Coombe, ward of the estate, all plain and proper and exactly as the Duke had instructed it drawn. Hester sat with the actual deed in her lap, following the Latin beneath the solicitor's English. Out of habit more than suspicion, the way she had followed 100 documents before it, she stopped at the third clause. "That is not what he read," she said. The room went still. Lady Octavia's chin lifted a fraction. "I beg your pardon, Miss Vane. The solicitor has read it entirely correctly. He has read what the summary says." Hester's finger did not move from the line. "The summary says the trust for Tam Coombe's maintenance is held in the estate's name, administered by his Grace. The deed says something different. Fiduciae administratio penes dominam Octaviam Renshaw maneat. The trust's administration shall remain in the hands of Lady Octavia Renshaw." She looked up. "That is not a custom. That is an alteration. Someone has had this clause rewritten since the draft I copied for His Grace myself, not 4 weeks ago, in my own hand. Nobody spoke. The solicitor's face had gone the colour of the paper in front of him. You cannot possibly read that fast enough to know the difference, Lady Octavia said, and her voice, for the first time since Hester had known her, did not have 3 notes in it. It had one, thin and quick. I copied it myself, Hester said. I would know the difference if you had changed a single comma. The Duke had not spoken. He rose now, slowly, and took the deed from Hester's hands and read the clause himself, though he did not need to, because he trusted the reading already and wanted, she understood later, only the small ceremony of confirming it in front of everyone, with his own eyes. My cousin, he said, has attempted to place the maintenance of a child under her own hand, in a document she believed no one present could read closely enough to catch her at it. She was wrong about exactly one person in this room. He set the deed down. I do not think I need explain to anyone here what that tells us about the folio that went missing from my library some months ago, or who might have had the most reason to want it lost. Lady Octavia did not weep, which Hester would remember afterward as the one thing about her that had ever been admirable. She stood, very straight, and said that she would remove herself to her sister's house in Bath before the week was out, and that she trusted no one would trouble to write to her there, and she was correct, because no one ever did. The wedding, when it came, was small, a duke's rank making it grand only in the number of carriages on the drive, rather than in any excess Hester would have permitted otherwise. She wore her mended gloves. He noticed, and said nothing, and she saw him notice, and that was enough for both of them. A year later, almost to the week, snow lay on Hallcross Hall, thick and quiet, and a fire burned in the library, where a copyist had once sat down at a stranger's desk to read him a stack of documents that had been lying to somebody for 40 years. Tam Coombe, 9 years old now, and installed at the Hall's expense in the village school, sat on the hearthrug with a book of his own, sounding out a psalm slowly, tongue between his teeth, while his mother mended by the window and pretended not to listen with pride. Hester sat by the fire with her husband's hand in hers, bare, both of them, the way they had taken to sitting most evenings once the day's business was done. Her father's primer stood on the mantel now, between a wedding portrait neither of them had wanted sat for, and a small carved box that held, among other things, a pair of very old, very carefully mended gloves. "Read me something," Rafe said, the way he still asked her most nights, though he had long since learned enough Latin himself to manage plainer passages alone. She opened the primer to the page her father had marked longest ago, worn soft at the corner from a girl's thumb, turning it 1,000 times before any duke had ever thought to watch her in the dark. Outside, a rook called once over the frozen garden and was still. A person is only ever truly seen once, in the one moment they believe no one worth impressing is looking, and everything a life is built on afterward is only the slow, patient work of proving that moment was not a lie,